Well, I'm pleased to share the stage with a friend of mine from way back, Tony Petitti, an American sports executive currently serving as the 7th commissioner of the Big Ten, and he's been there since May of 2023. Just a moment to talk about Tony's accomplishments. 40 years as industry executive with acumen in sports and entertainment. Began with Major League Baseball, actually most recently with Major League Baseball as Deputy Commissioner, Chief Operating Officer. Before that, a CBS Sports Executive Producer, Executive Vice President. Prior to that, was with ABC Sports and held a number of positions. And the one thing that I love to read about Tony is 14 Emmys, which to me is amazing. But Tony is a native of New York, earned his economics degree from Haverford in 1983, got his JD from Harvard Law School in 1986, and that's where we met. Tony, welcome.
Thank you, Len. Good to be here.
All right, let's get started here. You know, it's often debated, but, you know, as a conference leader and a former NCAA athlete, tell us, in your mind, how important are college sports to the education mission of these institutions?
Yeah, it's great. First of all, thank you for the time to be here. You know, for me, I sort of relate with my own experience about the opportunity I had to go to Haverford to continue playing baseball, which I loved. I wasn't nearly good enough to play in the Big Ten, but was happy to be a Division III athlete and what that, you know, allowed me to do in later parts of my life. So one of the things you realize when you're in this job, obviously we spend a lot of time at the bigger events. You go to football games this time of year. I'm on a campus every weekend. But I spend a lot of time going to see other sports, whether it's field hockey, soccer, you know, men's and women's basketball, lacrosse. We play 28 sports in the Big Ten. We've got close to 14,000 student athletes. And so for the large majority of them, like what they've accomplished to even get to the Big Ten academically and athletically is a remarkable accomplishment. And so you realize how important that is because most of them are going to go on and do really great things in other places, and a small percentage will play professionally. So, you know, it sometimes sounds like a cliche that the academic mission is important, but for virtually everybody on campus it is. It's the next thing they will do is take that degree and do something really important with it. And for those who continue playing, that's a great thing also. And so someone like you is even an incredible example of having both worlds, having an incredible athletic career, but then also pursuing law and teaching and everything else, broadcasting that you accomplished. So that's what we are around, and you realize it, and you realize the joy that the student athletes play with and the camaraderie. And so it's a big part of it. I know sometimes it kind of gets diminished because so much of the changes in college athletics are about, you know, more transactional. But I can tell you from being around student athletes a lot, like that connection to the university and what it means academically is still absolutely vital. And it's the way the administrators at these campuses think about what they're doing. I mean, you're around Maryland a lot, you know that. And one thing also I just want to say as an aside, because Len won't ask me, but we hired Len to broadcast the NCAA tournament for us back in the day when CBS had everything, and we had 8 announce crews, and I traded for Len. He was at ESPN, and we needed some help, and we were really impressed by his work. And so ESPN called. They wanted more NCAA highlights, and they wanted more U.S. Open tennis highlights. So we traded a few more minutes of highlights for the right to have Len work on the NCAA tournament. So that was it was an early trade. So Len might be one of the few guys that was actually traded for highlights.
That's one of the more valuable trades ever made, right? You know, you talk about the seismic changes in college sports. And, you know, for those of you who are aware, you know, you've got the House litigation that ultimately came up with a settlement. You had Alston before that. You know, what changes do you see and what do you foresee in college sports based upon, you know, those pronouncements?
Yeah, I think the first thing I noticed when I got the job was how much unmanaged change there was in the space. And what I mean by that was just decisions being made by lots of people outside the core of the system that were impacting how the system operated. You had a lot of different stakeholders that were coming together, a lot of plaintiffs' attorneys, you know, you had Congress weighing in, all these different groups. And I'm not sort of ascribing anything negative to their motivation. It just was a lot of different things that were taking the whole enterprise in lots of different directions. I kind of used and thought about my experience at MLB, about how much the game had changed in MLB without a single rules change. teams using analytics changed the game dramatically without any rules changes and without really necessarily making the game more entertaining. And so what Commissioner Manfred did when he made the rules changes was get back that control. And I felt the same way in looking at this job. It was a lot of unmanaged change. And so I think the first step was coming together with the other conferences in the NCAA to actually push the settlement through, to really embrace the idea that the settlement was the best path, because that was not the case when I first started.
Right.
So that then led to this sea change. And you hear a lot, well, this is broken in college sports and that was broken. And I don't believe that. What I think needed to be reset was the relationship of the institution to student athletes. And the biggest change was allowing student athletes to not only get their educational benefits, but also pursue NIL on their own, real NIL, and then also get paid in rev share if those institutions want to do that. So now where we are is, having put that in place, is can we maintain it, right? Because even though we've got it, that's why you'll read a lot about why do we need help in Congress, because we just put this system in place. It's only a couple of months old, and it'll get challenged pretty quickly. And so if we can get the help in DC to actually enshrine it for a while, operate it, learn about what's right and what we need to change, that's the focus right now, is getting this new system up and running, but also trying to protect it so we can actually operate it for at least a little while.
Well, we're going to get to the congressional input in a minute, but to further on what you just stated, you're conference commissioner of one of the autonomous four conferences, and you have the Group of Six, the FCS, you have non-football conferences. When we talk about House and Alston, do you see differing impacts on each of those segments? Yeah,
it's a really great question, because you learn pretty quickly that there's lots of places where we govern together with, mid-major conferences don't play football, some play FCS football, some don't. Even within the Group of Six, there's differences at the level that we play in some cases, and how they're all resourced. And we come together to govern, and there's lots of governing in college athletics with groups that don't necessarily do the same thing that happens on our campuses every day. So that's a little bit of a challenge in trying to figure out who's doing what. And the impact of rev sharing with student athletes is different in the Big Ten than it might be in another conference. And so I think when you're trying to make rules, I think the first thing is, what can we get more control over that makes sense for the A4? Where do we need to collaborate across and participate in the NCAA with decision making there? And I think Charlie Baker's done a good job to try to reset how we all integrate inside the NCAA. So that's been a big part of the change, not only the House settlement, but also Charlie doing some additional governance work to hopefully create a better structure for not just the A4, but for everybody else in the system as well.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your conference, the Big Ten. Through expansion, your conference now has a coast-to-coast reach. And, the question is, and this came from some of my students, in fact, when they knew that we were going to discuss, the state of college sports. How do you maintain, the sense of regionality when the conference was smaller? How do you maintain those historic rivalries? I know Michigan, Ohio State, that's an easy one. But obviously Penn State and Maryland hasn't been so good, but we continue to try and persevere. But, how do you maintain those? And they galvanize communities, and that's what makes college sports so attractive. Has that been a thought with regard to the growth and expansion of the Big Ten?
Yeah, 100%, and it's probably different by sport. It's not one scheduling approach to the 28 sports we sponsor, because, for example, we've got, in hockey, we have 6 institutions plus Notre Dame plays in the Big Ten. Then you have volleyball, we have 18, football, basketball. So you have some sports where you have complete conference participation, some that don't. Wrestling, we have 14 of 18. So I think the first thing is sort of looking at how you play and who participates in that championship. And then I will say the first place was really the football schedule, because when you have an 18 membership league, you have 17 available opponents, but we only play 9 conference games, which is the most any league plays, actually. So we have 9 conference games, you have 17 available opponents. And so to your question, Len, the key thing is, how often are you going to see? And what the conference did, which was really started before I got there, was figure out which games they wanted to preserve. And so obviously, we're going to play Michigan, Ohio State every year, but we need to play Michigan, Michigan State every year, right? And so when you look at it, Michigan's got 2 permanent opponents. Penn State actually has none. right? When Oregon comes into the league, they need to play Washington, so they have one permanent, right? SC is going to play UCLA. So it's actually different. Then we have Iowa, I think, that has 3 permanents. And so that was a really smart approach by the ADs because it preserved what's across. Now, what that does is it puts pressure on the rest of your scheduling to create competitive balance. I think of scheduling as something that you look at every single year. I think, obviously we get a lot of questions about our travel, especially in Olympic sports. And I think we set up the best structure we can, but what we've told the ADs, our coaches, and the student athletes is like, let us operate what we've put in place for a couple of years and see if it works. Is there a better way to schedule women's soccer, for example, than we're doing now? Actually, football is probably the easiest to schedule. It's once a week. And the travel, and you have buys. Typically in a football season, you'll have 2 bye weeks. So you're able to do some things to protect the travel. Yeah, I think other sports tend to be more challenging, but we just got to learn from it and figure out how regional scheduling works and what the best way to do it, how you bring teams down. Like, we did a really interesting thing this year. We had 15 schools coming to our basketball tournaments each year, like the last year. So not all 18 qualified for the Big Ten tournament, men's and women's. The men's coaches felt that was the wrong footprint, so we actually changed this year to all comers. So the natural tendency would be, we'll do the same for the women, but actually the women's coaches were adamant that they wanted to keep the 15 because they thought it was the best way to qualify more teams. And when you think about that, I kind of view that as equality of decision making. Like, let the women's coaches speak for their student athletes and their programs, not just have to make a decision because the men's coaches wanted something different. So the simple answer is scheduling is a critical piece of it. It's how you drive audience, it's how you drive attendance, and it's how you balance your competition. So I would say, we've done a lot of things right, and I expect to see some continuous change over the next few years, because it's not, I would never say it's perfect right now.
Well, a real quick leadership question is that it sounds like, you practice some democratic leadership. You listen to feedback, and you guys have maybe adapted to what people are telling you.
Yeah, it's funny, in the job, probably people don't necessarily know, you work for the presidents. So I have 18 bosses. I work for the presidents, and I work with the ADs. And then we have all of these coaching groups. But I actually take the approach that I work for all of them. Okay. And we've tried to bring our, in a period of real change like we have right now, we've met with all coaching groups. And I participate in virtually all of them when they come to Chicago for meetings, or we're on Zooms with our coaching groups. They're the practitioners. We're just sitting, removed, and a lot of the world's being done by lawyers across. And so they're just actually operating. And sometimes you forget to listen to what's happening, on the ground. So we try to do that. What's the best way to schedule? And I was proud of the decision that we made around the women's decision, because we let the women's coaches speak for their sport, not default, because the natural tendency is to try to always make everything the same. But yeah, we do a lot of listening to coaches groups. I actually, really feel like a big part of my job is to make it better for our coaches. To advocate for the Big Ten doesn't always make me popular, but that's who I work for.
Well, you mentioned 18 teams, 18 institutions make up the Big Ten right now. And given the rapid changes in college sports, you've got conference realignment, you've got NIL, transfer portal. How are these institutions navigating these changes? And, what role, again, do you play in their individual adaptation to these changes?
The first thing is the way the settlement's structured. The parties, because of who got sued, actually, is the way the settlement has been structured. So you see the A4 plus the Pac-12 and then the NCAA to some extent. So the first thing is for the 4 of us to come together. I meet with Commissioner Sankey, Phillips, and Yormark probably it's almost every week on a Zoom, and sometimes 2. Now with Brian Seeley and the new College Sports Commission, we meet with him on a weekly basis. So there's a lot of shared governance, and sometimes it's tricky because I kind of thought of it this way: the closer you get to the field or the arena, sometimes the harder it is to get consensus, because everybody's thinking, does that change help you win more game than we can, or is it the same, right? So you get into all these different discussions about that. But I would say the first obligation is to govern with the other commissioners, and then what I do though is when I meet with those commissioners, I've got consensus from our 18 ADs. I know what position they want me to advocate. So if they have a specific decision on where they want the portal to be, my job is to go into the room with the other guys and sort of advocate for the fact that the Big Ten wants the portal to be here. And sometimes we win and sometimes we don't. That's just part of shared governance. And luckily, I think in this change, the 4 of us have been on the same page for virtually all of it.
Now, one of the most, I guess, discussed elements of college sports with the changes that we speak of, the realignment, the travel burdens, et cetera, NIL, all those things, is the impact that all of that has had on academic performance and on mental health. I know that the Big Ten has some programs that have addressed those specifically. Do you want to let us know exactly what those have been and what
I
the
think
response has been?
Yeah, I think there's two pieces of it. The first that you raised is sort of the academic piece of it, and the second is kind of the way student athletes live on campus and what resources they have available to them, which is remarkable at the Big Ten. On the academic piece, it's going to be really interesting to see the data over the next couple of years about what the impact of high volume transferring has been, like the portal. And look, I don't advocate and say like kids should never be able to leave. I don't think anybody's even talking about that anymore. It's just like, can there be some more rationale to the system? Like when you talk to coaches, Len, one of the biggest changes from all of them is that connection to a student athlete for a number of years to develop them and make them better. And there's another piece of it that you see, because you're a really perfect example. You're very tied to Maryland, right? And you spent your whole career there. And so you're part of that community, and that community embraces you. When you're a student athlete that's played in 3 places in 3 years, you don't necessarily have that same connection. And so I think that's an important thing. Now, look, there's a lot of opportunities financially. There's a lot of pressure that student athletes have financially. Of course, they should do what's right for them and their family, 100%, and when they make those decisions. But if we can just try to figure out some incentives and some structure that will allow kids to think about staying at one place longer, if that's the best thing. Because when you transfer, you don't always take the credits with you. You can't always have the same major. It can potentially set you back. And so the short-term answer is like, we don't really know all the data yet. It'll take time to see what's happened across. But I also think there's a community effect. The second part of the question is about the life of a student athlete. When I've been to Congress in this job now, so I'm 2.5 years or so. I've been to Congress 16 times. And to meet with senators, White House staff under both administrations, all different kinds of combinations of people that care. And a lot of the messages that we deliver, and most of the time I do it with the other commissioners in the A4, is you should have more concern for student athletes when they leave our campuses in some ways, because what happens in the facilities and the mental health care and the training and the nutrition, I can only speak for the Big Ten. I can only speak for what we do on campus. It's not like football gets all of this and everybody else. There's remarkable facilities for every student athlete in the Big Ten. There's 2 years of post-separation care when you leave campus. There's mental health. No one's making appointments. I think student athletes feel really cared for. Not every experience is great. Not every connection with a coach works out the way you thought when you got recruited. But when you really look at the overwhelming bulk of all of it, it's pretty positive, because this is the result of a lot of change over a lot of years. And I think that you'll see that commitment to Big Ten. And so that's why it's important for us to maintain the resources, because just this year alone, in the Big Ten on Olympic athletes, we'll spend $680 million between educational benefits, training, travel, all the things that happen. It's remarkable. And most of those sports are not self-funded, right? They're not. There's no revenue in a lot of these sports, or most of them. So that's where we are. So I really feel like through a lot of change, and I'm sure, like if you look back at what it was like at Maryland when you were there, it's very different, right? In terms of the care and the 12-month-a-year care that happens.
Well, earlier we alluded to congressional action, and there are 2 legislative actions that are certainly in the news today. They're being discussed, and it could have a dramatic effect on college sports. The first one is the Student Athlete Fairness Enforcement, or SAFE Act, and that was proposed by Democratic senators. And essentially, the key elements of that are federal standards for NIL that would preempt the patchwork of conflicting state NIL laws. They would guarantee long-term scholarships regardless of injury or performance. It would also mandate post-eligibility coverage for sport-related injuries, establish uniform health and safety standards, regulate sport agents, and preserve revenue protections, including the ability of conferences to jointly negotiate media rights that, in some people's minds, would help fund Olympic sports. Then you have the SCORE Act, the Student Compensation and Opportunity Through Rights and Endorsement Act, which also establishes uniform NIL that preempts the state laws, provides, though, and this is important, a liability protection through an antitrust exemption from lawsuits that the NCAA has faced regarding athlete compensation and amateurism-related rules, which has changed college sports as we know it today. SCORE would also prohibit student athletes from becoming classified as employees. It would cover post-eligibility medical expenses and scholarship protection against injury or performance, and would also regulate agents. Now, I know that's a mouthful, but it's two competing bills, and I'm curious, Tony, what do you and your constituents favor and why?
Yeah, we spent most of our time, almost all of it, on the SCORE Act, and it's partly the legacy of the things that we think we need post-settlement and the things that are going back in the direction of extended medical care, things like that. So I think the SAFE Act, like, we haven't spent as much time. I think it does some things in terms of how the business of college athletics operates, which is a difference between the SCORE Act. So I'll focus on the SCORE Act. I think there's a few things that everybody should, like, if you're interested in this, what you should know is that the first thing is state preemption. So right now, there are many states that have gotten actively involved in passing legislation or court cases that lead to injunctions that, basically make it hard to have unified rules, right? And it will make it hard to actually operate the settlement. And a lot of that motivation of that is sometimes competitive, like helping. I'm not saying it's all bad, but it's made it very difficult because the main reason is we compete and recruit nationally. So national standards are really important, so we need to sort of figure out a way to enshrine that. So that's the first thing the SCORE Act would do, would basically protect, the enterprise from states weighing in and either enacting laws or leading to litigation that leads to injunctions. That's number one. Number two, that you mentioned is, the idea of employee status. I don't think student athletes that I've spoken to, there's student athlete representation in various forms of NCAA governments and conference, meetings. And you just don't hear a lot from student athletes they want to be employees. And I think they're getting the benefits of everything. And one thing people should understand about the employee piece, I think there's sort of this idea that if you become an employee, your life gets better. You have more leverage. And so think about it. If you're like, take a sport like field hockey, like if those student athletes are going to be in some sort of a collective bargaining unit, the number of hours they can be in the building and train and get access is going to go down because the institution is going to say, wait a second, if we have to pay you in the spring for working out and getting all that training, like, that's an economic hardship. Maybe the Big Ten could figure out ways because we're better resourced. It'll be very difficult for other places to be able to do that. And so there's just the nature of what the enterprise is. I don't necessarily think that employee status means, hey, big check mark win for student athletes. Number one, I just haven't talked to, any large amount of student athletes that believe it's the right path for them. So there's that part. So creating this status, enshrining the rev share, and the fact that students can get NIL and all the educational benefits. That's one. The last one that you talked about is, this idea of antitrust, like, I think we call it would be more like limited liability protection. And what I mean by that is, like, being able to actually set rules, and I would point to eligibility as one. Like, right now, it's really complicated to figure out what eligibility actually is. You've got kids that will, get waivers. You got kids that look at those waivers and say, well, I'm sort of exactly like that. And then you have some courts saying, no, you're not. You don't get the extra year. You have institutions who feel an obligation to support their student athletes, but they also want eligibility rules. So it's a really terrible place for an institution to be. So the ability to have some rules, because look, the enterprise has got something really important built in, which is, student athletes get to campus, they compete, they get their education, and they go on to do great things, and the next group is constantly pushing up.
Right.
To the extent that you lengthen, without any sort of structure, how long student athletes can stay, it's going to change the way young people can access the system, and as they come from high school, what's available.
And in reality, I mean, from an education standpoint, how long will it take to get a degree, especially if you're being compensated through NIL or something along those lines, and it's probably the best you're going to do, even in professional. You have a lot of people that want to hang on.
There's a lot of rules in the system that were built for the academic mission and student athlete development on the field, like in football, being able to play 4 games and still redshirt, right? Because that was important. A lot of high school kids, when you come into the Big Ten, the level of physicality you need, a lot of those kids aren't ready.
Right.
And so giving them a chance to develop is important. But the flip side of that now is when you layer rev share on top of that, it actually changes the way that rule operates. Like you can read about it. You have kids coming to see coaches after 4 weeks saying, I want to take my red shirt because that can open them up for another season of play. And it makes a lot of sense from a student athlete's perspective, but we've got to have some ideas. Like that's the tough thing when you're doing something new. I think it's true of any business, like how much of the old do you push forward? Like where's the, and so I think we're still working all of those things out, but that's what the SCORE Act would do. It would, take the states out of our business for the most part. It would allow us not to call student athletes employees, which I don't think they want to be. And really difficult change. And then the last piece is this idea that we can come together to set rules without getting sued as soon as we set them.
Well, I mean, when you talk about the idea of collective bargaining, it just reminds me of even back in the day when I played. First of all, when they injected the word labor into the conversation, I kind of raised my eyebrows because back in the day, all we had to do was remain eligible academically. Go out and work your hardest, not only in practice, but on the playing surface, and then become essentially a good citizen. And for that, I actually get a free education and whatever the few benefits that we got during those days. I never looked at it as labor. I looked at it as being the beneficiary of opportunity. Today, obviously, things have changed, and we recognize, the amounts of money that have flowed through a lot of pockets. But nevertheless, when student athletes talk about collective bargaining, do you think they really understand what that means?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I think maybe some you have a lot of student athletes whose
the value of education.
You have a lot of student athletes whose mothers and fathers were professional athletes, and so they may have been in a union, they may have been part of a collective bargaining system that their parents were in when they played and competed. So you see that. So there might be some specific understanding, but I'm not even sure how you would organize it. Are you organizing it by sport? Are you organizing it by conference? Are you negotiating across? Because I think one thing it's really important to understand: if you're a student athlete, if you're an employee for football, then you're an employee at lacrosse. It's the same control, right? You have a schedule in front of you. You're doing certain things. I've heard ideas, we'll make some student athletes employees and others not, but you're actually sort of doing the same thing. So if you're an employee, you're practicing whatever your amount of hours are, what's the difference? And so that's the first thing. I don't think it can be said, okay, we're just going to make the revenue sport athletes employees and everybody else won't be. I'm not sure how you do that. I guess you can do it with an act of Congress, but no one seems to be talking about it that way. So I think the collective bargaining thing is really complicated, and I'm not look. I came from baseball. It's probably the union does an incredible job of representing their players in MLB. There's no doubt about that. But it also there's a lot of other things that go with that, and I think most student athletes don't understand that how it comes together. And generally, unions do best when there's tenure and longevity. And this is an enterprise that's meant to have you come through relatively quickly. You're talking about 4 to 5 years. If you think about where unions are really strong, they're strong when they're built around systems of tenure and maintaining seniority. It's not exactly applicable to what happens.
And we both come from families who
your father,
right?
My father was a New York policeman and was in the PBA, the union, and that's where all of our benefits came from. I'm not an anti-union person at all. Every pair of glasses and medical appointment we had came from the union, I think my dad's partner was the union rep in the precinct. So, it's not that. It's just does that structure apply to this structure? And I don't know. I mean, I think there are probably some people who disagree with me would say that it can, but I think it's a very complicated transition that I'm not so sure makes it better for student athletes at all. I'm very suspect of that.
Now, we talked about, the litigation house particularly that now makes direct revenue share, the law, so to speak. Obviously you guys, the Big Ten has been in the news, potential third-party investments, and, some have characterized it as private equity involvement, but I think you have another story as to what it truly is, and this is a great opportunity to explain that position. the misinformation that's been out there has kind of characterized public opinion, and this is a great opportunity, Tony.
Yeah, and I'm happy to sort of address like the evolution of what the project has been. I think as you enter a space where where we have this additional cost of revenue sharing, and actually the more sponsorship and event and media money we make, the better for student athletes because they're getting 22% of that. So as we grow that pie, then in essence they're our partners in this business. The better we do across the 70 institutions that are in the A4 plus the Pac-12, the better everybody's going to do. So we started thinking about okay, there are many things that professional leagues do that don't happen in the college space. There are many of those things that we would never consider doing in the college space, but there are some that are instructive. So that was the beginning of the project. We then thought about, okay, if we organize ourselves that way, is there a partnership that could make us grow faster, make it bigger, make it better, help us get there? And so that's when we started at the direction of the presidents in the Big Ten, the chancellors, okay, let's study what that is. And that went on for a number of months. There was great interest from a lot of different entities. Where we are today is we still believe in this idea of creating an entity that focuses on our commercial business, because typically conferences generate virtually all of the money they send out to memberships through kind of one source only, and that's your national media package. The Big Ten with Fox and CBS and NBC, and the SEC largely with ESPN and ABC. That's where the source is. So that's different than what happens in the NBA or MLB when there's multiple things that they come together to do. So we started doing that. The source of the funding that we're sort of evaluating is it's not a private equity deal. It gets written that way. It's basically a nonprofit funding partner that we're looking at. And so whether we decide to take the investment or not will really be the decision of the 18 members. And that's after a lot of work, a lot of conversations, everyone on campus giving a tremendous amount of their time to evaluate what the best path is. And at some point, we'll conclude the process and make a decision about what's the right thing. But what we're down to considering right now is the funding partner is a not-for-profit. It's not some of the things that you guys may have been reading about. So, and we think that's the best fit. Not that those other things couldn't have worked, but right now, we think the best partnership idea is to go in that direction. But we still have to cross the threshold of deciding that partnership is the right thing. But we've done a lot of work. We have a tremendous amount of support for it. We just have to we have to finish the process.
Well, one key element is the fact that to recognize that the institutions are tax exempt because of their education mission. Mm-hmm. And from what I've read and understood, what you guys are trying to do doesn't interfere with that tax exempt status.
I can tell you, one of the first things when you study something like this, you get lots of people involved to sort of advise you on how you should structure and what you should do. And so we feel really confident that, what we're doing, look, in large part, this is all going back to institutions. Whether I don't think about it much differently. If tomorrow our conference or another conference announced that they had tripled their media rights and there was $6 billion coming in, I kind of think that's what the responsibility of a commissioner is. I don't think it's any different than what it's always been, because I was on the other side of it buying the rights for ABC and CBS. And it was funny, people said, oh, did people like Jim Delaney, who was a 30-year commissioner of the Big Ten, and Roy Kramer at the SEC, and Gene Corrigan, all legendary commissioners that I worked with back in the day, I always thought they were really tough negotiators trying to get every penny from me at ABC or CBS. And so I don't think any of that's changed, because I know it gets back to that $680 million enterprise that we're trying to protect. I can tell you one of the great things, since the House settlement, we've added as a conference close to 400 scholarships for women in our conference. And I think, with some continued adjustments in the settlement, that number can really grow significantly over the next couple of years. So, this is all about providing resources, making it sustainable. Every institution in the Big Ten is slightly different in terms of what their current needs are. And our job is to find the best path all. And I think another important part is maintain that connection the Big Ten has to each other. The conference has been around since 1896.
Well, before we finish our conversation, one of the things I think that's been front and center is the fear that with House and the financial responsibilities of directly paying student athletes, that other sports other than football, men's basketball, are going to suffer, and those are called essentially Olympic sports or non-revenue sports. What has been the plan of the Big Ten, obviously as the leader among conferences? What has been the plan of the Big Ten and the institutions, membership institutions, in trying to maintain the Olympic sport?
Yeah, I mean, we're among the highest sports sponsorship leagues in the country. Right? We have Ohio State at 36 sports. We only sponsor 28 in the Big Ten, so they're playing multiple sports that do not have a Big Ten championship. And you have you have Penn State, Michigan, all the way down. There are some that are smaller. But the other thing that's interesting, like the great thing about the Big Ten, like there's a pocket of schools where hockey is a really big deal. Like you go to Penn State and Iowa, wrestling is just incredible. You go out to Washington, rowing is incredible. And so, USC with track, Oregon, like there's just lots of different priorities in different places. And I think, everything that we've talked about in the leadership room, whether it's with the presidents and chancellors or with the ADs, is to maintain and grow the commitment. And that's why we're pursuing some of the things we're doing. We've got to figure out where the revenue comes, right? So we're spending more on student athletes. The cost and the care that we're giving is growing. The scholarship commitment, hopefully will continue to grow. So you've got to find a source to do that. And I think, that's where we are. But I know there's lots of noise about save this, save Olympic sports. I can just tell you in the Big Ten in Paris, we had athletes compete just on Team USA. We were in 15 different sports. I think either us or the ACC won the most medals. We had the highest number of athletes across. We were a remarkable part of Team USA. Penn State wrestling right now is a remarkable part of the national team's success. So there's a lot of that. And I think the Big Ten, if you think of the key tenets of the Big Ten and how it's connected, it's the academic alliance among the institutions. These are all large research-based institutions that really care about that academic alliance with each other. And that's a whole living thing. They have their own academic alliance and they share all kinds of resources. The second is the conference has always been about broad-based sports, competing well all the way down. And then the last piece is the commitment to strengthen football because it's the engine that helps you fund a lot of this, right? So you need those three things, right? And so I think of those things all the time as being the way we're connected. And I mean, that was a long answer to a simple question. Is we want to grow our commitment to Olympic sports. We've got incredible facilities that were built. You can go to Maryland, they're building new things there. And that provides that training that these athletes need.
Well, the important thing for everybody to remember with regard to Olympic sports is that unlike other countries, the predominance of the training ground for our Olympic teams in every sport is done on college campuses. So it's extremely important that colleges and universities recognize how they have to fund, they must fund those opportunities.
Yeah, and I think
revenue.
I think one thing to add, if I can, is just on the women's side especially, there's an explosion of interest. And if you look at, we had this incredible, connection with Caitlin Clark. But if you think about what happened was not only her as a player, how great she was and how she connected, but the way the fans reacted in Iowa. I mean, they sold everything out, and then that became a phenomenon across the entire Big Ten. Everywhere she showed up was sold out. Iowa women's basketball has the most watched women's basketball game, I think, before up until at least this WNBA season on 7 different broadcast platforms, right? The most watched. We had 92,000 people watch volleyball outside of Nebraska. We've set volleyball records in viewership. So we're at this explosion. All the work that was done over the years to find balance for women is really coming together. And the job is, I'm hopeful that in a few years, when we think about how we negotiate our media contracts, we won't just lump everything together, right? We'll actually be able to sell a separate volleyball package to a media platform, a streamer, broadcaster, whoever it is, and actually isolate the value that's being created.
Look
by
at the
that
numbers,
sport.
Nebraska women's volleyball.
It's just remarkable. They sell out. We're working on events to actually increase. We don't currently play a women's volleyball tournament. We're thinking about how that could actually happen. We're trying to do more. We're trying to create more events like the outdoor event we did with hockey last year at Wrigley Field. It's right on the edge of being something really special, and there's this great interest, tremendous student athletes, great coaching, and fan bases that really care. And I think that continued into the WNBA and the success that they're seeing is remarkable. So I feel like the conference is a big part of that growth on women's sports because if you just look at volleyball and women's basketball, I feel like we've done a remarkable job largely by the way we compete, but also because the fan bases really care. Like, Nebraska volleyball fans travel. Like,
Yeah.
I've seen it. Iowa women's basketball fans, we had to open up our building early to let them in because they were there an hour before the doors were opening. And so we had to open the facility. The last year that Kate and Clark played, we let everybody in early because they were lined up outside freezing.
All right, in the last couple of minutes that we have, anybody who's watched the Big Ten Network or you watch the national telecast of Big Ten sports, have seen, how the Big Ten lauds what they've been doing. Are there any final thoughts, as a leader in the industry, about what you want the public to know about your conference, where you are today, where you're going, anything that has been misleading out there? There's an opportunity to kind of clean that up.
Yeah, I would just continue by what I just said. The conference is deeply committed to supporting Olympic sports. It's deeply committed to the academic mission that it has, and the job in the conference offices is to provide those resources to sustain those missions and actually grow them. I think you should all root for us to be able to operate the House settlement. I'm a big believer, you put something in place and then you tweak, right? I've always felt that way, maybe whether it's the programming side when I was at CBS and ABC and executive producing at CBS, when you watch something on the air, that Sunday, what are you thinking about on Monday or Tuesday? And because we got to work together at CBS. So that's the way I sort of look at it. It's the same thing here. This is a big change. People need to be patient. They need to understand that hopefully we got most of it right out of the gate, but there's going to have to be an evolution of how we do these things, and people have to be patient. But I can just promise you, it's all done with great intentions. It's done to the people that are in this business deeply care about student athletes. You just have to walk on campus to feel it. The coaches, the connection, the families. So I'm really proud that I get to be around that because I really believe in it. It worked for me in a really small way. Growing up in Queens, we probably lived 5-10 minutes apart from each other when we were growing up. And so, to have that journey, and I look at Division III baseball as a big part. So what we do in the Big Ten is at a scale that's exponentially bigger than that. We just got to keep doing it.
Well, Tony, thank you very much. I recognize the Big Ten as maybe a model for college sports as we know it going forward. And obviously, this is a leader, and I appreciate all the comments. And thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be with you.